"You are the man I saw in my dreams. According to the sacred law, you are my husband now." He worked at a small bookkeeping firm in the city, where numbers, deadlines, and invoices filled most of his day. He enjoyed the steady rhythm of his job. It gave him a sense of security. At home, he cared for his aging mother, a woman who had spent her life raising him and supporting him in every way she could. Their life was quiet, uneventful, and safe, the kind of life that allowed Daniel to feel at peace without asking for much more. Despite his quiet life, Daniel was not lonely. He had a few close friends who would call him over the weekends to hang out, and he enjoyed the occasional evening stroll around the neighborhood. Still, he couldn't deny that something was missing. He had seen many people around him get married, start families, or fall in love, and he often wondered what it would be like to experience that kind of connection. But Daniel was a practical man. He never rushed into relationships and didn't believe in love at first sight or destiny. Life, to him, was about making sensible choices, and he had always trusted that if the right person came along, it would happen naturally. It was a seemingly ordinary Thursday afternoon when everything began to change. Daniel had just finished his work and decided to take a short walk through the busy market street near his office. The air was warm with the hint of spring, and the chatter of vendors and shoppers filled the street. As he moved past a small flower stall, he noticed a woman standing a few feet away, looking directly at him. She seemed confident, composed, and completely unafraid to meet his gaze. Daniel paused for a moment, surprised. He had seen strangers staring at him before, but something about the intensity of her gaze made him feel unsettled. The woman walked up to him without hesitation. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I need to talk to you. It's important." Daniel blinked, unsure of what to say. He had no idea who she was or why she seemed to know him. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" he asked, trying to maintain his composure. The woman smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile meant to be friendly. It carried a quiet certainty, as if she already knew something he didn't. "No, not in the way you think," she replied. "But I've seen you in my dreams, and not just once, many times. And according to my faith, according to the sacred law I was taught, that means you are meant to be my husband." Daniel's mind froze. For a moment, he thought she must be joking, but her expression was serious. He searched her face for any hint of humor, but found none. "Your husband, I think you've made a mistake," he said cautiously. "I don't know you, I'm sorry, but I don't think I can." "Please listen," she interrupted gently but firmly. "I know it sounds impossible, and I would not approach you if I didn't believe in it completely. My dreams started when I was very young. I have seen you clearly over and over before I even knew your name, and now that I have seen you in person, I know it is real. My family believes in the sacred law, and the law says, the man I see in my dreams is my husband. That is why I am here." Daniel's heart raced. He had heard of people having strange dreams or feeling a connection to someone, but this was something he had never imagined. He took a step back, trying to process the situation. I don't even know your name. How can you say something like this? This is really unusual." "My name is Miriam," she said softly, "and I understand how strange it must sound. I wouldn't have believed it either if I hadn't lived it myself, but it's not just about me. It's about the tradition I was raised in, the beliefs that guide my life. I respect you, and I am not here to force anything. I only wanted to tell you the truth as it is, according to my faith." Daniel looked at her, feeling a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and curiosity. He didn't know what to say. There was a calmness about her, a certainty that made her words difficult to dismiss. Yet he was practical, grounded, and logical. Dreams were personal, he knew. They could be meaningful, but they were not contracts, not promises, and certainly not laws that applied to anyone else. Still, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was different. There was something about the way Miriam spoke, the way she carried herself, that suggested she genuinely believed what she was saying. It wasn't obsession. It wasn't manipulation. It was faith. And there was a quiet courage in admitting such a thing to a stranger. Over the next few minutes, Daniel asked her questions. Where did she come from? What did her family believe? How could she be so certain? Miriam answered each question with patience, explaining that she came from a deeply traditional community where dreams were seen as spiritual messages, guiding major decisions in life. From a young age, she had been taught that the man she saw in her dreams was chosen for her, and that her happiness depended on honoring that vision. Daniel listened carefully, trying to understand. He could see the sincerity in her eyes. But he also felt a strong need to assert his own boundaries. "I understand that this is important to you," he said finally, "but I have my own life, my own choices to make. You cannot decide my life based on a dream. I respect your beliefs, but I cannot agree to something I have not chosen for myself." Miriam nodded slowly, as if she had expected this reaction. "I know," she said, "and I do not wish to force anything upon you. I only wanted you to know, to be honest, and to recognize the truth of what I believe. The rest is your choice." For a while they stood in silence, listening to the bustle of the market around them. Daniel felt a strange mix of emotions, disbelief, curiosity, and a hint of wonder. He had never encountered anyone like Miriam before. She was different, not just in what she believed, but in the way she lived her beliefs with grace and respect. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I need some time to think. This is not something I can respond to immediately." Miriam smiled gently, a smile that carried both warmth and understanding. "Of course, I do not expect an answer. I only hope you will consider what I have said." She turned and walked away, leaving Daniel standing there, his mind swirling with questions he had never anticipated. As he continued his walk, Daniel found himself thinking about the encounter over and over. He tried to reason it out logically. Dreams were dreams. Faith was faith. He had the right to make his own choices. And yet, there was something about Miriam's conviction, her courage, and her belief that lingered in his thoughts like a whisper he couldn't ignore. That evening, Daniel shared the story with his mother, hoping for guidance or perhaps reassurance that he was right to be skeptical. She listened quietly, her expression thoughtful. "Faith is powerful," she said finally. "Sometimes it brings people together. But you must always follow your heart, and your heart is yours alone. Be kind, but be true to yourself." Daniel nodded. He understood her advice, but it did little to settle the unease in his chest. The encounter had shaken the comfortable rhythm of his life. For the first time in years, he felt that life could surprise him in ways he could not control, ways he had never imagined. Over the next few days, he found himself glancing around for Miriam in places she might appear. He kept thinking about her words, about the sacred law she had spoken of, and about the dreams she had seen. He could not explain why, but a part of him wondered if this was the beginning of something significant, something beyond ordinary, something that might challenge everything he thought he knew about life, destiny, and belief. And so Daniel's ordinary life, quiet and predictable as it had been, began to shift. A stranger's dream had entered his world, carrying with it the weight of tradition, faith, and an unexpected challenge. He did not yet know how he would respond, or how this meeting would change him. But he knew one thing for certain. From the moment Miriam spoke those words, nothing would ever be the same again. After the unexpected encounter with Miriam, Daniel found it difficult to focus on his usual routines. The rhythm of his life, the quiet office, the predictable evenings with his mother, even the friendly banter with coworkers, felt different. Everything seemed slightly heavier, as if her words had left an invisible weight on his shoulders. He kept replaying the scene over and over in his mind. Her calm confidence, the certainty in her eyes, the strange way she spoke about dreams and sacred law. He had always considered himself a rational man, grounded in logic and reason. Yet something about her conviction refused to be dismissed. Over the next few days, Miriam began appearing unexpectedly in his thoughts. He could picture her walking toward him in the busy market, smiling gently yet firmly. He imagined the clarity with which she had spoken about her dreams and the sacred law. Daniel didn't understand why he felt drawn to think about her. He was not in love, at least not in the way people usually described it, but he couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity and the odd sense that fate had somehow nudged him out of his ordinary life. Then, one morning, as Daniel arrived at work, he found a small envelope slipped under the door of his office. Inside was a neatly folded note in familiar handwriting. It read, "I hope I did not startle you the other day. I only want you to understand that I mean no harm. I would like to meet you again, only to explain more about my dreams and the beliefs that guide me. If you choose not to, I will understand. Miriam." Daniel felt a mixture of surprise and unease. Part of him wanted to ignore the note and pretend the encounter had never happened. Another part, however, was curious, deeply curious. Who was this woman who seemed so certain about him, a stranger based on dreams? And why did he feel compelled to respond rather than simply dismiss her? After some thought, he decided to reply, keeping his message polite but cautious. "I appreciate your note. I am willing to meet briefly to understand more, but I must make it clear that my life decisions are my own. I hope that is acceptable." Miriam responded quickly, agreeing to meet in a quiet cafe on a side street, a neutral place where they could talk without interruption. The day of the meeting arrived, and Daniel found himself both anxious and strangely excited. He rehearsed what he might say, trying to prepare for her explanations, for the stories of her dreams, and for whatever beliefs she held that had compelled her to approach him in the first place. When he arrived at the cafe, Miriam was already there, sitting at a corner table with a calm and patient expression. She greeted him warmly, as if they were old acquaintances rather than strangers brought together by the extraordinary circumstances of a dream. Daniel sat across from her, trying to steady his racing thoughts. "I'm glad you agreed to meet," Miriam said softly. "I want to share with you what I believe, not to pressure you, but so you can understand my world." Daniel nodded. "I want to understand," he said. "I just need to be honest that I may not agree with everything you believe." She smiled. "I do not expect agreement. I only ask that you listen, and perhaps you will see why this is so important to me." And so she began. Miriam spoke about her childhood, about a community steeped in tradition, where dreams were not merely random images of the mind but messages that carried meaning and guidance. She described how she had first seen Daniel in her dreams when she was a teenager, long before they had met, and how the vision had continued to appear in her life at critical moments. Each dream, she explained, reinforced the message. This man, this stranger she had never known, was destined to be her partner according to the sacred law. Daniel listened carefully, fascinated despite his skepticism. He asked questions, trying to understand not only the specifics of her beliefs, but also the emotions behind them. Miriam answered openly, speaking of fear and hope, of longing and responsibility. She admitted that her faith sometimes scared her, that the weight of the sacred law was heavy, and refusing it would feel like rejecting a part of her own life. Yet she never tried to coerce Daniel or make him feel guilty. Her conviction was strong, but so was her respect for his free will. As the conversation continued, Daniel began to notice something subtle about Miriam. She was not fanatical. She was not demanding. She was earnest, patient, and composed. Her confidence came not from force, but from deep belief, and that made her presence almost magnetic. Daniel could not deny that her dedication to her faith and her clarity about her dreams was impressive, even admirable. Yet he struggled with the idea that someone else could feel so certain about him without ever knowing him. "I understand your faith and your dreams," Daniel said at one point, "but you must understand that I cannot make life decisions based on visions that are not mine. I respect your beliefs, but I need to live according to my own reality." Miriam nodded. "I understand, and I would never ask you to do otherwise. I only want to be honest. I believe what I believe, and I need you to know the truth. What you do with it is entirely your choice." The clarity of her words left Daniel thoughtful. He realized that this encounter was not about forcing him into a relationship. It was about honesty, courage, and faith. Miriam's approach, though unusual, was filled with respect for his autonomy, which made it even harder for him to dismiss her. Over the next few days, Daniel noticed how the encounter began to influence his daily life. He found himself thinking differently about ordinary moments, the people he passed on the street, the choices he made, and even the dreams he himself had sometimes ignored. He began to wonder how much of life was truly under his control, and how much might be shaped by unexpected events, connections, and beliefs. His friends noticed a subtle change in him. During lunch breaks and casual conversations, he seemed more thoughtful, quieter, and at times distracted. Some teased him gently, suggesting he had fallen in love, but he would smile and deny it, knowing that what he felt was not that simple. It was curiosity, reflection, and an acknowledgement that life could be more complex than he had ever imagined. One evening, as he returned home from work, he found his mother waiting for him in the living room. She had noticed his distraction and concern etched on his face. "You've been thinking a lot lately," she said kindly. "Something is on your mind, isn't it?" Daniel hesitated, but decided to share the story of Miriam's dreams and the sacred law. He explained the encounter, the cafe meeting, and her honesty about her beliefs. His mother listened carefully, nodding as he spoke. "Faith is powerful," she said gently. "It can guide people, comfort them, and sometimes challenge those around them. But you must remember your life is yours." You can respect her beliefs, but you must also protect your own freedom to choose. It is possible to be kind, understanding, and still remain true to yourself. Her words comforted Daniel. He realized that he did not need to dismiss Miriam's beliefs to maintain his own. Respect and understanding could coexist with autonomy and choice. And perhaps, he thought, that was the most valuable lesson he could learn from this unexpected encounter. Despite his resolve, Daniel could not deny that the story was beginning to weave itself into his life in subtle ways. Every time he walked through the market, he found himself glancing at the corners where he had first met Miriam. Every time he heard someone speak of fate, dreams, or destiny, he felt a flicker of recognition. Life, which had once seemed predictable and safe, now felt larger, richer, and full of possibilities he had never considered. Miriam, for her part, continued to act with patience and dignity. She did not push, text excessively, or try to manipulate Daniel. She simply lived according to her beliefs and allowed him the space to make his own decisions. And that, Daniel realized, made her conviction even more remarkable. By the end of the week, Daniel found himself reflecting not on the idea of marriage or destiny, but on the qualities he had witnessed in Miriam: courage, honesty, and faith. He wondered why these traits moved him so deeply, and he realized that perhaps the encounter was less about prophecy and more about understanding a person who lived so authentically and unapologetically according to her beliefs. Daniel knew that the situation was far from resolved. Miriam's dreams, her sacred law, and the expectations of her community would continue to intersect with his life in ways he could not yet predict. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of anticipation, not dread. Life was no longer just a series of predictable routines. It was unpredictable, challenging, and strangely beautiful. And so, the ordinary life Daniel had known began to shift. A stranger's faith had entered his world, bringing with it questions, reflections, and a subtle, growing awareness that life could surprise him in ways he had never imagined. The story was far from over, and the days ahead promised lessons, challenges, and revelations that would test his understanding of belief, respect, and the choices that define a person. Daniel's life had already begun to feel different, though outwardly nothing had changed. He still went to work, still completed his daily tasks, and still cared for his mother. But inside, he felt as if a quiet storm had started. The encounter with Miriam, her dreams, and the sacred law had unsettled something deep within him. It was no longer just curiosity or intrigue. There was now a mixture of tension, reflection, and a strange sense of responsibility. He felt compelled to think more about the situation, not because he was obligated to, but because it had touched a part of him that he rarely acknowledged. He found himself wondering how someone could feel so certain about a stranger, and yet act with such respect and patience. Miriam's courage fascinated him. Unlike people he had met before, she had approached him without any expectation of immediate acceptance or compliance. She had spoken her truth and left the choice entirely in his hands. That, Daniel realized, was far rarer than anything else he had experienced in life. Still, the question that weighed on his mind more than anything else was simple yet unsettling. Could it be possible that destiny, faith, and belief were somehow guiding him towards something he could not yet see? One Saturday morning, Daniel decided to take a long walk through the part of the city where he and Miriam had first met. The market streets were busy with vendors calling out their goods, the smell of fresh bread and fruits filling the air, and the chatter of shoppers moving from one stall to another. It was a world he knew well, yet today it felt different. Every corner, every face, every sound seemed to hold some hidden significance. Perhaps it was merely his imagination, he told himself. Yet the sense of anticipation, of unseen possibilities, lingered like a shadow he could neither ignore nor fully understand. As he walked past the flower stall, he noticed a small bouquet tied with a simple ribbon, placed where Miriam had once stood. He paused for a moment, feeling a strange mix of nostalgia and unease. He didn't expect her to be there again, but the memory of that first encounter, the calmness in her eyes, the certainty of her words, remained vivid in his mind. He felt a growing urge to understand more, not just about her dreams, but about the person she was and the faith that guided her life so completely. Later that day, Daniel received a message from Miriam. She had written simply, "I understand if you need time, but I would like to meet again. I feel that speaking openly about our thoughts may help us both understand this situation better." Daniel read the message carefully. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to pretend that life could continue as normal. Another part, however, felt drawn to respond. He realized that avoiding the situation entirely would not bring clarity or peace. Life, he thought, was rarely predictable, and sometimes the unexpected could teach more than the ordinary. He replied after a few hours, agreeing to meet, but making it clear that his intention was to listen and understand, not to make any immediate decisions. Miriam responded promptly, setting a time for the following evening at a quiet park near the river. The next day, Daniel spent most of the afternoon thinking about what he would say, how he would respond, and how he could express his thoughts without offending her. He found himself reviewing his own beliefs about life, faith, and destiny, questioning things he had once taken for granted. He had always thought that life was controlled by logic, decisions, and personal effort. Now he was beginning to wonder if there were forces, or at least experiences, that could challenge that certainty. When he arrived at the park, Miriam was already waiting, sitting on a bench under a large tree. The golden light of the evening sun filtered through the leaves, casting gentle shadows on the path. She greeted him with the same calmness that had marked their first meeting, and Daniel felt a strange sense of ease despite his nervousness. "I'm glad you came," Miriam said softly. I think it's important that we talk openly without rushing or pressure. Daniel nodded. I want to understand truly. I may not agree with everything, but I want to listen and respect your perspective. They walked slowly along the park path, talking about life, faith, and dreams. Miriam explained more about her community, how her family and elders interpreted dreams as sacred messages, and how those messages guided life decisions such as marriage, education, and personal responsibilities. She spoke of the fear and hope intertwined with her faith, the fear of rejecting destiny and the hope of finding fulfillment by honoring it. Daniel asked questions carefully, trying to see the world from her perspective. He wanted to understand not just the beliefs themselves, but why they mattered so deeply. Miriam spoke with honesty and humility, never insisting that he accept her views, but sharing the emotional and spiritual weight of her experiences. What I see in my dreams is not just a vision, she said at one point. It is a responsibility. I feel that if I ignore it, I am ignoring a part of my life, a part of my purpose. But I also understand that others must make their own choices. That is why I am here, to share the truth with you and then let you decide for yourself. Daniel felt a mixture of respect and awe. He realized that this was not merely a story about dreams or sacred law. It was about courage, honesty, and integrity. Miriam was living in a way that few people dared, faithful to her beliefs while respecting the autonomy of another person. Yet, despite his admiration, Daniel's mind could not stop questioning. I respect your courage and your faith, he said carefully, but I need to be honest with you. I cannot make decisions about my life based on someone else's visions. I have to follow my own path, and I cannot let dreams, however meaningful, dictate my choices. Miriam nodded, her expression serene. I know, and I never expected otherwise. That is why I am patient. This is not about forcing you or making you feel guilty. This is about honesty between us and with ourselves. As they continued walking, Daniel began to reflect on his own experiences. He thought about the relationships he had pursued and ended, the friendships he had maintained, and the small moments in life that had shaped him. He realized that, until now, he had rarely questioned the bigger forces that might influence life: faith, intuition, or unexpected encounters. Miriam's presence had forced him to confront these ideas, and though he could not fully accept them, he could not dismiss them either. By the time they returned to the bench, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Daniel felt a calm clarity settling within him. He understood that he was not ready to accept Miriam's beliefs as his own, and that he might never fully understand the depth of her dreams. But he also understood that he had gained insight into courage, honesty, and the power of living faithfully according to one's convictions. I cannot promise what you might hope for, he said quietly, but I can promise that I will respect you, listen to you, and try to understand. That is the best I can do. Miriam smiled. That is all I ask, and I believe that in time, understanding will grow on both sides. We do not need to rush. Life is long and lessons come in their own time. As Daniel walked home that evening, he felt a mixture of relief and reflection. The encounter had been intense, challenging, and thought-provoking. He realized that life was not simply about routines, predictability, or control. Sometimes, the most meaningful lessons came from unexpected people, unusual circumstances, and questions that could not be answered immediately. That night he thought about Miriam's dreams, the sacred law, and the choices each person must make in life. He understood that destiny, faith, and belief might not always align with logic or personal desire, but they were forces that shaped human experience in powerful ways. He also recognized that respect, patience, and honesty could bridge worlds that seemed entirely different, allowing understanding without agreement. For Daniel, the encounter had changed the way he viewed himself, his life, and the possibilities around him. He realized that life was no longer just a series of routines and predictable events. It was a living, evolving journey, shaped by interactions, beliefs, and experiences that could not always be explained. And though he did not yet know what the future held with Miriam, he understood that this unexpected meeting had already left a permanent mark on his life. He drifted to sleep that night with a mind full of questions, reflections, and possibilities. Dreams of his own began to stir, visions of choices, responsibilities, and paths he had never considered. And somewhere in those dreams, Miriam's presence lingered, not as a demand, but as a reminder that life, belief, and human connection could arrive unexpectedly, transforming the ordinary into something extraordinary. Daniel did not yet know how the story would unfold. He only knew that life, once predictable and quiet, was now richer, deeper, and filled with unexpected challenges and lessons. And for the first time in a long time, he felt both unsettled and alive, ready to face whatever came next with honesty, courage, and an open heart. As days turned into weeks, Daniel noticed that the unusual encounter with Miriam was no longer confined to fleeting thoughts or quiet reflection. It had begun to ripple into his daily life, in ways subtle yet persistent. He found himself thinking about her dreams, her beliefs, and the sacred law she had spoken of almost constantly. Even at work, when he focused on numbers and reports, his mind wandered back to the conversations they had shared. Something about her presence, her honesty, and the conviction in her words had left an impression he could not ignore. Then one afternoon, while walking home from work, Daniel received a phone call. It was from Miriam. Her voice was calm, but there was a hint of urgency he hadn't heard before. "Daniel," she said softly, "my family, they want to meet you. They want to understand that I have truly seen you in my dreams and that this is important according to our tradition. I want you to know that this is their way of respecting both of us, and it is not meant to pressure you. But it is important to them, and they wish to meet you soon." Daniel felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to avoid the situation entirely, to retreat into the safety of his familiar routines. Another part, however, recognized the significance of this step. He realized that he could no longer simply observe from the sidelines. The story had begun to intersect with other lives, with expectations he could not ignore. After a few moments of hesitation, he agreed to meet her family, making it clear that his attendance did not signify agreement with their beliefs. The day of the meeting arrived, and Daniel found himself standing nervously outside a modest home on the outskirts of the city. Miriam's family welcomed him with polite smiles and warm gestures, though the seriousness in their eyes was unmistakable. He could feel the weight of tradition in the air, the sense that every word, gesture, and glance carried meaning beyond what he could immediately understand. Her father, a tall man with a quiet authority, spoke first. "Daniel," he said, "we have heard much about you from Miriam. She has shared her dreams and her understanding with us. We respect that life is a matter of choice, and we do not wish to force anyone. But we also hope to understand the man she has spoken of for so many years." Daniel listened carefully, trying to remain composed. He had expected a formal, possibly intimidating encounter, but instead found a family that, while rooted in tradition, approached him with respect and calm. He answered their questions honestly, explaining his life, his routines, and his principles. He made it clear that while he admired Miriam's courage and belief, he could not make life decisions based on someone else's visions. Miriam's mother, a gentle woman with kind eyes, nodded thoughtfully. "We see your honesty," she said softly. "That is all we could hope for. Our traditions are strong and our faith is deep, but respect and understanding are equally important. We only wish to meet you and speak openly. That is all." As the meeting continued, Daniel noticed how deeply Miriam's family valued their faith and the sacred law. but he also noticed how they balanced that with patience and respect for him as an individual. It struck him that their approach was not to intimidate or coerce, but to honor the connection that Miriam had felt in her dreams, while still allowing him to maintain his autonomy. Despite the civility of the meeting, Daniel could feel the subtle pressure of expectations beginning to build. Miriam's family believed strongly in the sacred law, and their approval carried weight in her life. Even though he knew he was free to make his own choices, he also recognized that his decisions could have consequences for Miriam, for her family, and for the delicate balance between tradition and personal freedom. Over the next few days, Daniel found himself reflecting more deeply than ever before. He realized that life was not always about simple, predictable choices. Sometimes the presence of another person, their beliefs, and their traditions could intersect with his own life in ways that challenged his assumptions. He felt a growing sense of responsibility, not to obey, not to comply, but to act with honesty, compassion, and awareness. Then came a turning point. One evening, Daniel received a message from Miriam, telling him that she had spoken to her family again, and that they wished to hold a small gathering to discuss the matter further. It was not a wedding proposal, not a demand, but a formal recognition of her dreams and the sacred law, and they wanted him to be present. Daniel hesitated. He knew attending would bring him face to face with intense emotions, cultural beliefs, and expectations that might feel overwhelming. But he also knew that avoiding the gathering would not provide clarity, nor would it honor the honesty he had promised both Miriam and himself. On the day of the gathering, Daniel arrived early, his heart beating fast. The room was modest but filled with warmth. Miriam's family was there, along with a few close relatives and friends from their community. They greeted him politely, acknowledging his presence with respect. Miriam stood quietly nearby, her expression calm but focused. The discussion began with Miriam speaking first. She explained her dreams once more, describing the visions she had seen over the years and the certainty she felt about him. She spoke of her faith, her fear, and her hope, emphasizing that her intention was never to force him, but to share the truth she had lived with for so long. Her voice was steady, and her words carried a sincerity that made it clear she was speaking from her heart. Daniel listened, feeling the weight of the moment. He could see the importance of this gathering, not just for Miriam, but for her family, her community, and the traditions that had shaped her life. Yet he also felt the growing pressure of expectation, subtle but undeniable. He realized that while he could not allow visions or sacred law to dictate his life, he also had to navigate the emotions and beliefs of those around him carefully and respectfully. When it was his turn to speak, Daniel took a deep breath. "I respect your traditions and your beliefs," he began, "and I honor the courage it takes to live according to them. But I must be honest. I cannot make life decisions based on someone else's dreams, no matter how sincere or powerful they may be. My life, my choices, and my responsibilities are mine alone. That said, I promise to be honest, respectful, and compassionate in all my interactions. I hope that is acceptable." There was a moment of silence. Then Miriam's father nodded slowly. "We understand," he said quietly. "And that is all we could ask. Respect, honesty, and compassion, these are the qualities that matter most. We only wish to know that our daughter's truth has been heard and respected. That is all we seek." Miriam, standing nearby, smiled softly. Her eyes reflected relief, gratitude, and an unspoken understanding. Daniel realized that the tension he had felt, the subtle pressure of expectations, had been transformed into a mutual recognition of honesty and respect. He did not need to comply with her dreams. He only needed to acknowledge them with sincerity. Over the next few days, Daniel noticed how the encounter had changed the way he viewed relationships, expectations, and the intersection of faith and personal choice. He realized that life often brought challenges that required more than simple decisions. They demanded courage, honesty, and the ability to navigate complexity with grace. He also understood that Miriam's belief in the sacred law, while different from his worldview, was not a threat. It was simply another perspective, one that could coexist with his own principles if handled thoughtfully. Yet, despite the clarity he had gained, Daniel could feel the emotional intensity of the situation lingering. Miriam's family and community had invested hope and faith into the idea that he could be part of her life in a special way. While he had not agreed to anything beyond honesty and respect, he knew that every interaction, every gesture, and every conversation carried weight. He would need to be mindful, patient, and understanding in all his actions, recognizing that human connections often involved responsibilities beyond simple logic or choice. As the week drew to a close, Daniel reflected on the journey he had undertaken. What had begun as a chance encounter in a market had evolved into a series of complex, deeply human interactions. He had met a stranger whose dreams had revealed a vision of him, faced the expectations of her family, and navigated the tension between faith and personal choice. He had learned about courage, honesty, respect, and the delicate balance between honoring someone else's beliefs and remaining true to his own. And yet, he knew that the story was far from over. The weeks ahead would bring further challenges, decisions, and revelations. Miriam's dreams, her sacred law, and the expectations of her community would continue to intersect with his life, and he would need to navigate these experiences with care, patience, and clarity. But for the first time, Daniel felt not fear, but a sense of preparedness, a readiness to face the complexity of human connections, the tension between faith and choice, and the lessons that life presented in unexpected ways. He understood, finally, that the most meaningful journeys were rarely simple or predictable. They were shaped by encounters, choices, beliefs, and the courage to act honestly in the face of uncertainty. And as Daniel walked home that evening, he carried with him a newfound understanding. Life was not only about control, predictability, or routine. It was about navigating the unexpected, honoring both oneself and others, and embracing the lessons that came from the people and experiences that crossed one's path. The weeks that followed the meeting with Miriam's family were a time of quiet reflection for Daniel. The intensity of their earlier encounters had faded, replaced by a contemplative calm. Life returned to its familiar rhythms: work, caring for his mother, occasional walks through the market. But the encounter with Miriam and her faith remained a constant presence in his thoughts. He realized that while he had maintained his autonomy and respected his own choices, he could not ignore the lessons that had been woven into his life by this extraordinary series of events. Daniel found himself thinking more deeply about human connection than ever before. Miriam's belief in the sacred law, while unfamiliar and unusual in his worldview, had forced him to consider the power of faith, tradition, and conviction. He reflected on the courage it took for her to speak openly about her dreams, to approach a stranger with honesty, and to remain patient even in the face of uncertainty. These were qualities he admired, and he began to recognize them not just in Miriam, but in others around him, people who lived authentically according to their beliefs and values. One evening, Daniel decided to visit Miriam, not to discuss marriage or destiny, but simply to talk as two people who had shared a significant part of their lives. He wanted to express his respect, gratitude, and understanding. When he arrived at her home, Miriam greeted him warmly, as if no time had passed, yet there was an unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had transpired between them. "I wanted to see you," Daniel said quietly. "Not because I have answers or decisions to make, but because I want to thank you, for honesty, for patience, and for showing me something I had never considered before." Miriam smiled softly, her eyes reflecting warmth and relief. "I am glad you came. That is all I ever hoped for. We do not need to have all the answers, Daniel. Understanding is sometimes enough. They sat together in the garden, speaking about their lives, their dreams, and the lessons they had learned. Daniel shared stories of his childhood, his mother's influence, and the routines that had shaped his life. Miriam spoke of her faith, the traditions that guided her, and the courage it took to live authentically according to those beliefs. The conversation was calm, honest, and free from expectation, a rare moment of connection that both of them cherished. As they spoke, Daniel realized that their story was not about destiny or sacred law alone. It was about respect, honesty, and the ability to navigate complex human experiences with grace. Miriam's dreams had brought them together, but it was their willingness to communicate, to listen, and to honor each other's choices that had created a meaningful connection. Over the next few days, Daniel reflected on the concept of choice and responsibility. He realized that the greatest lesson he had learned from Miriam and her family was not about faith or tradition, but about the importance of acting with integrity. Life, he understood, was rarely simple or predictable. People, beliefs, and circumstances often intersected in ways that challenged assumptions and forced growth. And in those moments, honesty, empathy, and courage became the guiding principles that shaped meaningful outcomes. Daniel also recognized the subtle ways in which his perspective had changed. He had become more patient, more reflective, and more open to experiences that lay outside his usual understanding. He had learned to see value in beliefs different from his own, not as threats, but as opportunities for connection and learning. Miriam's presence had reminded him that life was not solely about control or certainty. It was about openness, awareness, and the willingness to embrace the unknown with respect and understanding. One afternoon, Daniel received a note from Miriam. It was short and simple. "Thank you for your honesty, your respect, and your kindness. I have learned much from you as well. Life may take us on different paths, but I hope we continue to honor what we have shared." He read the note carefully and felt a sense of closure and peace. He understood that their paths might never align in the way Miriam's dreams had predicted, but that did not diminish the impact of their connection. It had shaped him, challenged him, and expanded his understanding of faith, respect, and human relationships. In the weeks that followed, Daniel focused on integrating these lessons into his everyday life. At work, he approached colleagues with greater patience and empathy. With his friends, he engaged more deeply in conversations, listening without judgment and appreciating perspectives different from his own. And with his mother, he shared more openly, discussing ideas and experiences that once seemed too abstract or challenging. Daniel also reflected on the nature of faith and belief. He did not adopt Miriam's views as his own, but he learned to respect the role that dreams, traditions, and spiritual convictions played in the lives of others. He realized that belief was not a matter of right or wrong, but a guiding force that gave people strength, purpose, and courage. Miriam's courage to follow her dreams, balanced with respect for his autonomy, had taught him a profound lesson about human integrity. Months later, Daniel and Miriam met again, not as strangers, not as participants in a prophecy, but as two individuals who had shared a journey of understanding. They spoke of life's challenges, their hopes, and the ways in which they had grown. There was warmth, trust, and mutual respect in their conversation, a recognition that while their paths might differ, the connection they had formed was meaningful and lasting. "I have come to understand something important," Daniel said during one of these meetings. "Life is about more than control or certainty. It is about navigating the unknown with honesty, compassion, and courage. You have reminded me of that, Miriam," she smiled gently. "And you have reminded me that belief must always respect others. Dreams may guide us, but they cannot exist without understanding, patience, and integrity." Daniel nodded, feeling a sense of fulfillment and calm he had never experienced before. Their journey together had begun with the extraordinary dreams, sacred law, and chance encounters. But it had ended with something even more valuable: mutual respect, personal growth, and the understanding that life's most meaningful lessons often come from unexpected places. In the months that followed, Daniel returned fully to his routines, but with a changed perspective. He continued his work, cared for his mother, and maintained his friendships, yet he carried with him a quiet awareness of the larger forces that shaped human experiences. He had learned to see value in connections that challenged him, to approach situations with empathy, and to navigate complexities with patience and integrity. Miriam, too, continued her life with renewed clarity. She pursued her dreams, honored her faith, and respected the autonomy of others, recognizing that true belief could coexist with understanding and compassion. Their encounters, while no longer guided by urgency or expectation, remained a source of reflection and inspiration for both of them. Daniel often thought back to the moment they first met in the market, and he marveled at how a single encounter could ripple through life in unexpected ways. A stranger's faith, honesty, and courage had challenged his worldview, reshaped his understanding of human connection, and taught him lessons that would remain with him forever. He realized that life was not about following a single path dictated by destiny or expectation. It was about engaging with the world authentically, acting with integrity, and embracing the lessons that arose from every encounter. And while Miriam's dreams had once set the stage for an extraordinary story, the real transformation had occurred within himself. A deepened understanding of respect, choice, and the power of human connection. One evening, as Daniel walked through the same market where their journey had begun, he noticed a small flower stall. The scent of fresh flowers filled the air, and the sunlight cast gentle shadows across the street. He paused for a moment, remembering Miriam's words, her dreams, and the courage she had shown. He smiled quietly to himself, knowing that while life might never unfold exactly as dreams predicted, the experiences, reflections, and lessons gained were far more valuable than any prophecy could promise. In the end, Daniel understood something simple yet profound. Life's meaning was not in certainty or control, but in the ability to face the unexpected with honesty, respect, and compassion. It was about learning from others, understanding different perspectives, and finding strength in the connections we create along the way. Miriam had been a catalyst for this understanding, a reminder that even the most unusual encounters could leave a lasting imprint on the heart and mind. As he continued walking, Daniel felt a sense of peace he had never known before. The extraordinary experience had come to a natural close, not through resolution of destiny or fulfillment of sacred law, but through understanding, growth, and respect for the journey of life itself. And in that quiet moment, he knew that life, with all its unpredictability, challenges, and lessons, was richer and more meaningful than he had ever imagined.